independence, love, social convention, gender roles, and religion. Charlotte Bronte's most famous novel challenges ideas on all these topics, and we are here to discuss it. I'm Charlene.
And I'm Mike.
And this is Jane Eyre Files. Chapter 28, A Candle in a House. Hello, husband.
Hello, mere specter.
I don't think I wasted away here.
James Bond reference?
No. Of course, James Bond.
Unfortunately, there's not a lot of references to Jane.
She's pretty solitary in this chapter.
The only one, there was another line that I did like, which was "Lady in every point," but that's the reference to Diana and Mary Rivers.
I see.
And
yes.
So, Jane is not referred to by many phrases, but mere specter is one of them.
All right, James Bond for the win.
Yes, welcome back.
I know. We've been away for a little bit. We've had some life changes similar to Jane. She's moving to a new house. We moved to a new house.
We're just like Jane.
Yeah. I mean, thankfully we weren't destitute on the streets. But it was...
I'll make a few mortgage payments and then I might just be destitute. We'll see.
Don't say that. Okay, so we're happy to return, and I'm hoping that everyone is sticking with us. We're getting into a third part of the story where Jane is sorely tested, and she's moving on to a new chapter in her life.
Yeah, I feel like sometimes you need to take a break from these things. I know we could have just blown right through 38 chapters, I guess, but and I think you've made reference to it before off of the air that this is probably a perfect point to take a break.
Right.
She's left Thornfield, and like you said, this is the third and sort of final act of the book.
Yeah, and the tone changes, the stories really becomes different.
Yeah, it does. It becomes quite different, Mm-hmm. And the last chapter was very intense.
Yes.
And this chapter is very depressing, but it's not nearly it's a little more simple, right?
Yeah, it does. We don't have too much happening because it's very focused on this particular moment in time of Jane just wandering and trying to find a different place to live, find sustenance. So let's just get right into the SparkNotes summary for chapter 28. Riding in a coach, Jane quickly exhausts her meager money supply and is forced to sleep outdoors. She spends much of the night in prayer, and the following day she begs for food or a job in the nearby town. No one helps her except for one farmer who is willing to give her a slice of bread. After another day, Jane sees a light shining from across the moors. Following it, she comes to a house. Through the window, Jane sees two young women studying German while their servant knits. From their conversation, Jane learns that the servant is named Hannah and that the graceful young women are Diana and Mary. The three women are waiting for someone named St. John. Jane knocks on the door, but Hannah refuses to let her in. Collapsing on the doorstep in anguish and weakness, Jane cries, "I can but die, and I believe in God. Let me try to wait his will in silence." A voice answers,
"All men must die, but all are not condemned to meet a lingering and premature doom, such as yours would be if you perished here of want."
The voice belongs to St. John, who brings Jane into the house. He is a brother of Diana and Mary, and the three siblings give Jane food and shelter. They ask her some questions, and she gives them a false name, Jane Elliot.
Jane Elliot.
The summary kind of condenses a lot of this chapter to just the very last few moments in the end.
Well, it's funny because even Jane herself doesn't like talking about it.
Yeah, she passes through it, but I feel like we do get quite a bit of detail in this chapter, where in the beginning, Jane leaves Thornfield with such haste. She just jumps on the coach and says, "How much money? How far can you be with this much money?" And he's like, "This far." Okay, fine. But then she forgets her purse in the coach. She didn't really have a lot of stuff with her to begin with. And then she ends up really very sadly destitute. And I was wondering, is there a better way for her to leave Rochester?
I'm not really sure. I can completely respect her decision to not want to stick around, obviously. Yeah. But what other options did she have besides leaving quickly?
I wonder if she needed to leave quickly.
Yeah.
Would Rochester, if she's afraid of Rochester, maybe he wouldn't he would have been a little more angry, or he would have tried to really keep her
more persuasive.
Yeah, keep her at Thornfield, but
and maybe she knew if I let him talk me into it, that's not good for me and my faith and stuff, right?
Maybe she's afraid of her own, weakness that she might give in to Rochester. I didn't think of that.
Do you think she could have returned to Gateshead?
Well, the last we've heard, which I'm not sure exactly in the timeline, like the Gateshead was shut up, I thought, and Liza went over to become a nun, and then Georgiana got married. So I don't know if I doubt she really would have been able to go back to Gateshead.
She can wander through there and then see if there's anybody that can let her in or feed her, because they might recognize her at least. But then my thought was, I would imagine that might be the first place that Rochester would have looked.
That's true. She needed to get away somewhere that he couldn't find her.
Yeah, when you think about domestic disturbances, a lot of times, if there's a quarrel and a fight, and one party, especially if the woman says or leaves, what's their first place they're going to go? A lot of times they're going to go to family, right?
Sure. Yeah.
And so this is, as far as I know, that's pretty much the family that she has is Gateshead, even though there's very few of them. But yeah, I could see that. I could see, and then Rochester showing up at the door at Gateshead, trying to win her back over.
Yes. Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that's been in at least one adaptation of Jane Eyre, the Orson Welles, Joan Fontaine, where she goes back to Gateshead, and or it was also the '96 adaptation with Charlotte Gainsborough, where she goes back to Gateshead, and it's okay, I guess. They could do that.
Or some creative liberties.
There's also in the 2011 adaptation, which is a great showcase for Mrs. Fairfax, where she says to Jane, when Jane comes back at the end, spoiler alert, that she could have come to Mrs. Fairfax for help. That she would have given her some money. She would have tried to, get her away. And I thought, that's really sweet. That's a great kind of thought to put in this adaptation.
But I bet you Jane would have been too proud to do that, because I bet you she probably didn't want anybody to know where she was, especially Mrs. Fairfax.
Yeah, I wonder if Mrs. Fairfax would have kept her secret, although she'd just give her some money and then she'll just get away.
That's true.
She'll have to tell her where she's going. But anyways, Jane did not do any of those things.
No. She was wandering the moors aimlessly.
Yeah, unfortunately. But she does derive a lot of comfort in nature, and in these really beautiful passages that Charlotte Bronte writes about how she kind of has no one else to turn to, so she is embraced by nature, and she sees that as evidence of God's assistance, which I think is a nice way of framing her destitution.
Yeah, I mean, there's that word I always bring up when I talk about this book, is vivid. It's a very vivid depiction of what it's like sleeping outside.
Oh, yeah.
Again, when I first picked up this book, I did not imagine there's going to be a point where the heroine of the book would be sleeping outside.
Right.
And then she describes every place that she turns into a bed.
Yeah.
She sat there for a few nights, and so she's like, okay, the first night there was this. And I mean, it's, when you're reading a book like this, you try to picture it in your head. I have a hard time I just can't. I'm like, okay, I see a tree maybe in a hillside. Yeah. I feel like I'm looking at the Shire in the Lord of the Rings book, okay, is she under a tree and the ring wraith is coming at her or something? I can't quite picture the way that they're describing a hearth.
I do think that, we went to Haworth, which is Charlotte Bronte, where she lived. And there's the moors that surround that parsonage. And, we didn't really get a chance to explore that area. I've done a couple of walks in it before. But that kind of area is what is being described in this chapter, I feel. Okay. Yeah, that it's very, it's beautiful in sort of a wild, barren way, where, you get these very open vistas, but there's a lot of heather and, soft grass and, but rocks. So, it's
no shade trees or anything.
Probably not a lot of trees. Yeah. So, I should say Jane is trying to find shelter in this really kind of open, barren land.
Yeah. And I feel like there haven't really been a lot of moments of her out in nature, right? I mean, you see her kind of wandering around Thornfield and with all the flowers and the hedges, right? And stuff like that. And
the gardens.
But then it seems like, she finally gets a chance to spend some time underneath the stars. And I'm sure Thornfield is quite peaceful as it was, as large as it was. But this is really an opportunity for Jane to give her some peace, chance for reflection. She seems to grow a lot more devout.
That's true.
In this chapter, which I think is sort of one of the core virtues of this character, which, it comes out in various moments, whether it be when she's in school and she's keeping to her faith, and obviously when she leaves Rochester, the previous chapter has a lot to do with her faith. But then all of a sudden, there's a lot of moments where she's, like you said, talking about evidence of God's assistance, is what you called it, right?
Yeah, that's very true.
Yeah, and what I thought was really interesting too is I love how on day 2, like the morning sunshine just totally cheers her up.
Oh, yeah.
Like there's a quote where she says, "What a golden desert this spreading more. I wished I could live in it and on it."
Oh, yeah.
You know, and I think like Charlotte really painted a wonderful portrait of Jane sort of becoming one with nature.
Yeah, it's sort moment. Of it's a healing moment for her.
You ever have those? I mean, I feel like, and it's funny, I've been having those a lot since we moved into this new house. There are mornings when I wake up and I just go outside and I kind of just look around my property, you know. I'm not renting. This is all ours now. And I'll just sort of look at the grass and you listen to the birds and
newfound appreciation.
It puts you in a good mood, ready to get ready for a work day, I guess. Yeah.
Well, not for Jane, again. She is
destitute. Nice segue.
She's jobless. She's left her job. But yeah, she's very, she's in such a poor mental state, just generally. She's exhausted, she's heartbroken, she's hungry, but I find it interesting that she remains practical and focused on what she needs to do, which is find employment and lodging. That she, goes into this town and she's just very analytical and relentless in how she can find employment.
Yeah, I feel like she's not just simply begging, I imagine most people would probably view her as a vagrant just because of her circumstances. But, I think like there's a weird aspect of vagrancy where there's a appearance of what they're supposed to look like. And so Jane probably didn't look like that.
Right.
And so I'm sure that might have been a little bit weird.
I think she also takes pains that she doesn't want to look like that. She wants to look at least presentable, a little bit look clean as possible. So she doesn't want to alarm people. But I feel like that way that she kind of describes her situation, it's so detached, which probably is partly due to how painful this situation is to her, even in hindsight, as she's recounting it in this book. But, she really cares that she doesn't want to alarm people. At one point, she says, "I felt sorely urged to weep, but conscious how unseasonable such a manifestation would be, I restrained it."
Yeah, like I said, there's a certain appearance of what you expect from someone who's a vagrant. If I may, Charlene, I'd like to tell you a story. I'm going to delight our listeners with the tale of a man named Aaron Huey. Now, Aaron Huey is a photographer. I saw him give a lecture about maybe 10 years ago, and his claim to fame was that he walked across the country. He went to the pound and he got a dog, and he loaded up this wagon, and he walked from San Diego to New York, and he basically documented it the whole time as a photographer. And he told stories about how, along the way, people would stop and ask him what he was doing, and he would explain. And he said there were several times that people would, if it was like a housewife, would take him home and let him stay at their house and say, "Tell your story to my children," and inspire them. Because he said he didn't sleep outside every day.
Yeah.
But he made a point to mention that one of the supplies that he brought with him was a razor. Because he said that most people have this view of homeless people as being very unkept and unshaven.
Sure.
And so he made it a point to shave every morning while he was outside. So that people were just like, what's this clean cut guy doing walking across the country?
Right.
And it raised questions. And so like that's the first thing I thought of when I was reading about how Jane is so worried about her appearance and she doesn't want to, like I say, alarm people, is that, people have a preset idea in their mind of what, this person's going to ask me for money. We've all done it. I'm sure you've walked somewhere and you're like, you see someone, you're like, oh, is this person going to come up and beg? But then if they're clean cut, you wouldn't assume that.
Right.
And so I guess when Jane is sort of, she's well dressed, she's very plain, but the question is how dirty did she get sleeping out and outside? Yeah, who knows?
Yeah. Well, it kind of reminds me of that point too in the story where she goes up to the farmer who's having bread and she asks for it, and she thinks that he thought maybe she was just some eccentric lady who just wanted some bread, but not really, someone who's homeless and destitute.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I was going to ask you, like, was this a very skeptical time? Does it seem like the residents of that town didn't care enough?
Oh, I don't know. That's a interesting question. I mean, probably, you think with a small town that people would be a little bit more welcoming,
Yeah,
or
even especially the church. The church, she gets no help from the church.
Especially, as a young woman who's coming to ask you for help, maybe if it's an older man or someone who looks a little bit more dangerous to another woman, they wouldn't want to. They'd be a little afraid to help them. But for a pretty unassuming, plain young woman, you think, oh yeah, of course, let me help this poor girl.
Yeah, I was trying to think, what was the economic, times like during the Victorian era?
Yeah, maybe if everybody else had it rough, they're like, well, we don't have any money or food to spare. I'm sorry.
Yeah, and I think this chapter also highlights just how difficult it must have been for women to find work.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
When they weren't just answering ads in paper, right? Like, what she does with Mrs. Fairfax. But like, wasn't there a point where they're like, oh, all the people work at the factory, and she's like, oh, do they hire women? Nope.
Right. Well, I do find it especially sad that it does take her to near starvation and true desperation for her to finally ask food, which she gets from the farmer and then also from that little girl who's just giving slop to the pigs.
Oh, yeah. And that's why the question I wanted to pose to you right now is, is it at this point that you think she may have regretted her decision?
Ooh, that's a hard question to answer. I feel like she doesn't, like, there is no other alternative. Like, she was never, going to try to go back to Rochester, because obviously in this point, she could have tried to just say, hey, well, let me just go back to Thornfield. I know I can get food. I know someone's going to be real happy to see me.
Yeah.
And she doesn't.
Bertha will be incredibly happy. She'll have another veil to tear up. Yeah, it's great.
But she doesn't even consider that. What she decides is, oh, well, I guess I'm just going to die then. So I don't know if she would actually regret her decision in terms of like, oh, let me change her mind. She's not going to change her mind.
No.
Yeah. What do you think?
She is stuck in her ways. Yeah.
Well, she's going to follow through with what she believes.
Yeah. Because I wonder, at what point do you just keep going, and then you hope that somebody at some point,
I mean, clearly she's not thinking, clearly, basically.
Well, yeah. But it makes, like I said, it's she has that strong moral conviction, which is also kind of a double-edged sword.
Yeah.
Right? Like, she's being punished.
That's true. It is. It's because it's such a difficult chapter, to read with how much suffering she's going through. Mm-hmm. She has really tried her best to live a really upright life, and now we have to see her in this way.
Mm-hmm. Pride gets in the way, right?
Do you think she's too proud?
Well, yeah, perhaps. I mean, but what's funny is, she didn't really start out with much in the story. I mean, yes, she had a little bit of comfort at Gateshead, but she never seems to ask for any help during her life, right? Mm-hmm. So it's like, why start now?
Oh,
so that must have been
so independent.
Yeah, and that must have been incredibly difficult for her, because she knew she had to leave, but then at the same time, she's just like, I got to be able to figure this out myself.
Right.
And unfortunately, you just can't. At that time, as a woman with no money in the middle of nowhere, you have to kind of get the comfort of other folks, and eventually you have to ask for help. And I guess, like I said, I can give her credit for trying to ask for work rather than just food, but at the same time, it's like the situation of that town in that era it made it incredibly difficult.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I also feel that I kind of really understand where she's coming from, because I think that I would have just as much difficulty asking for help when I don't expect anyone to go out of their way for me.
Yeah. And like I said, if it's somebody who's doesn't look like a stereotypical vagrant, the cynic in me tends to assume that those people can be scam artists, And I think that's kind of funny how, like, that's what happens with Hannah when she makes it to the house. Yeah. It's like, Hannah's just like, where are your other people? This has got to be some kind of an act.
Yeah, like someone's going to come rob our house. But yeah, it's fine. It's funny that seems to be this idea that persists with, homeless people. Is it necessarily true that there are a lot of people kind of pose as, vagrants or something, and they're gonna rob you? Or is that something that we just put on ourselves so that we don't feel so bad that
I wonder
we're turning away people? Like, oh, well, they're probably gonna do something to us, so yeah, we can't help them.
Yeah, because I feel like, especially where we live, it's there's enough people that you can't help everybody, and so it's like a lot of times you end up not helping anyone because you don't want to start. And I feel like I remember there was a time when I first moved to LA many years ago where we were walking around downtown and somebody asked me for somebody asked us for money or whatever. But the guy was like, he looked like he was going out on a Friday night.
Oh.
Like he had jewelry and like really nice shoes and clothes and stuff. And it was like, huh? It was really bizarre where it was like, this guy just want money to go. He's going to pretend that he's homeless or pretend he needs money, and then he's just going to go to the club because he was dressed way too nice to be asking for money. So it was a little bit weird. But I wanted to bring something up to you as well, and that is, I feel like at the core of this chapter, this chapter is all about strength, and Jane has, she's suffered her share of mistreatment throughout the book, but this is where she really shows how strong she is, like both physically and emotionally, as well as spiritually. Like, I think the fact that Rochester is still alive gives her strength.
Oh, yes.
She points that out, as a wise man once said, that's the power of love, right? She's using that to drive her through. And then there's this great line. You talk about the candle in the house that she sees with St. John and the Rivers family, is that the quote is, "This light was my forlorn hope. I must gain it." And I thought that was just amazing to see Jane find this inner strength to drive her to this house that is ultimately going to change her life. Like, it feels like the journey, like, it's so funny. She, again, Charlotte vividly describes the nature in this chapter. And there's that point where Jane's like, okay, I'm going to sleep outside for one more night, even though it's raining. And then when she sees that candle, it's like 3, 4, 5 paragraphs describing from the point when she sees it to the point that she shows up at the doorstep, right? Because at one point she says, like, oh, the candle went out. Oh, it was just a brick wall.
Yeah.
Like, I dipped below a brick wall. Like, she really makes it a point to make this absolute goal that she has to attain, and she just keeps striving for it. It's very inspirational. Yeah.
Oh, that's a very good point. I like that this is a chapter about strength, because, Jane does show her strength a lot throughout this book, and now it's, come to a head in a way where she's, I feel like her resisting the temptation of staying with Rochester is a big point that shows her strength, but also persevering in the face of her own sort of personal devastation and loss. But she's still trying to push herself to stay alive.
And it's all a candle. It's one little light that kind of guides her way, right?
So this candle is illuminating this beautiful little home where a nice family resides. But I think that Jane sees such comforting imagery in this house with this fireside and these nice ladies reading books who are interested in learning. They seem well educated. And then this older motherly servant who's with them. And the fact that these young ladies are closer to Jane's age too, I wonder if that makes it easier for her to try to appeal to them.
Yeah, I don't think Charlotte doesn't point out that most of the people that Jane has talked to in this town that she's been asking for help have all been older, right? Maybe those are the ones who are a little more cynical. Yeah, and you're right. Maybe it's easier to relate to someone of your own age. I just hope that they aren't too much like Blanche or the Reed sisters, right?
I'm sure Jane hopes that too.
Yeah.
How desolate, how desperate my own position seemed compared with these. They were all delicacy and cultivation. I'd nowhere seen such faces as theirs. Yet beg from them I must, or die.
She does talk to the motherly servant for a bit, who kind of rejects her. And then this mysterious man who's just listening to this exchange between Jane and the servant Hannah decides to save Jane only after she resigns herself to dying and awaiting God's will. And then we hear from St. John. Yeah,
I do love his introduction.
Yeah, it's a very great introduction.
I had to have you let me say that line in the Sparks notes. Because it's like something, it's very cinematic. You can see that, like, where she's just sitting out by herself, and like you could just hear the dialogue coming from off screen.
Oh yeah.
And then you just see this sort of
like the
man
voice of God.
And this man in shadow. I feel like the occupants of the house keep referring to him, and then he quietly shows up at like the most fortunate time for Jane. That's why I feel like it's very cinematic. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, my viewpoint of St. John is colored a little bit by what I know of him in the coming chapters. So I do think, that's funny that he would just wait to help her until after he hears the exchange between her and Hannah. Is he maybe not going to help? Was she just waiting to hear if she has some nefarious plan in mind? And he wasn't going to help her unless she mentioned God?
Well, you wonder, like, how long would you think he was out there?
Oh,
Because they're waiting for him, right? So it's like maybe it's a situation where he literally just pulled up and I was like, well, who's this person?
Oh, he heard the exchange.
Oh, the whole exchange, right?
I think so.
Is it something where he could have heard it as he's walking up from behind that brick wall?
Probably,
or you think he's standing still and just silently observing?
That would be funny. He just, why would he just stop and stare? Like, just watch, but...
Yeah.
He's a funny character, Sinjin.
Yeah, and I feel like, I'm guessing he probably wanted to make sure that she didn't have, like you said, a nefarious plan in mind, or if there was other associates. It's hard to imagine this man of God turning her away. Like, he was going to let her in, which is surprising that the fact that Hannah was so resistant.
Oh, yeah.
Because he's a pastor. You would think that the servant of this pastor would be more welcoming to people.
Yeah, would be used to having to take care of people's strays, basically. But, so we come to the end of this chapter where now Jane is with this new family who are taking her in, and she seems to really trust them that they'll just do what they need to take care of her. So the reader is introduced to a whole new set of characters, and then, again, a whole new chapter, as it were, of Jane's story.
Yeah, I feel like, the story has taken a definite turn. And it's definitely not what I was expecting. When you have this idea in your mind of this Victorian romance, I didn't realize that Rochester's really only in that middle third.
Oh, yeah.
And it's very literary that all of a sudden your romantic hero, your Byronic hero, is now gone, and now there's somebody completely else that has dropped into this story with his family.
Yeah.
And you're like, oh, what's going to happen next? So it's like, I'm really excited to reread the next chapters, because I remember thinking, like, where's this going now? Because there's no way you can expect anything at this point on. It makes, I really think it makes for such a wonderful read, because it's completely unexpected. And I wanted to point out to you too, I love that, the last paragraph of this chapter, it just really makes you want to curl up in a warm bed. Doesn't it? Because it's just she talks about how she's got her clothes off. She's finally going to get into sleep after you've been reading about her sleeping outside for 3 days. I have a hard time myself not wanting to just curl up and into a warm bed myself.
Yeah, get some warm milk.
There you go.
Well, we're coming to the end of this podcast episode, but first we have to talk about our favorite and meaningful passage or quote. So what did you pick from this chapter, Mike?
Okay, well, mine's more from the beginning of the chapter when she first heads out and she's sleeping outside. And she says, quote, "Not a tie holds me to human society at this moment. Not a charm or hope calls me where my fellow creatures are. None that saw me would have a kind thought or a good wish for me. I have no relative but the universal mother, nature. I will seek her breast and ask repose." And I feel like this is a moment where Jane returns to solitude, where I feel that she tends to thrive in these situations. When you've gone through something as traumatic as she has, sometimes you just kind of have to go back to basics, right? Just strip it all down, start from scratch. She's literally back at square one. It's as if she never arrived at Thornfield. And I think this whole segment just does a really great job of setting up the final act of her story. Where it's like a reboot, right in the middle of, right in the 2/3 mark of this book, right? Or not even more than 3/4 of the way through this book, yeah.
Yeah. Oh, well, this chapter is very difficult to pick like a meaningful quote, because I feel like it's such a dark chapter. It's not really full of moments that you want to remember of Jane, because she's doing so poorly. But you did pick a great quote, because I picked it as well.
No.
Yeah, I just think it also captures that sort of what we talked about in the beginning of like how Jane just kind of embraces nature and how it helps her kind of get through. It's like a healing moment for her, and it helps her get through this sadness and depression that she's probably going through. So it's a great quote.
Yeah, like sometimes you have to get to your worst to dig yourself out of it. Sometimes.
And it also shows that, that strength that she doesn't depend on other people to sustain her. She can find her own like inner sustenance, and with the help of Mother Nature.
Well, yeah. And I did like I said, we mentioned it earlier, but I like how, there's a lot of moments where Charlotte will say, address the reader. Reader, I did this. Reader, I did that. And it's usually somewhat more positive. Whereas this one, the exact quote I wrote down was, She says, "Reader, it is not pleasant to dwell on these details."
Yeah.
And at one point she says, "I'm sick of the subject." Right?
Yeah.
Because it's just like
it's very honest.
Yeah, it's so bad, but yet she feels like she has to tell you some of it, but she's not going to go too deep into it. She'll go really deep into the grassy area that she's sleeping on and this candle that she has to get to. But at the same time, it's like, you don't want to see me begging. You don't want to see, you don't need to see that.
Wow. We won't have to worry about it anymore because now that she's with a nice family, we're going to see what happens to her in the next chapter.
Yeah. I'm curious to find out where we go from here. She's got shelter. She's got food. She's got people who are helping. So it's just, it could be a totally new book.
Yeah. Definitely. Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed our podcast, please subscribe and leave us a review on your preferred podcast platform. This really helps us grow and reach new listeners. If you want to talk Jane Eyre with me online, you can find me on Twitter and Instagram at EyreGuide. That's EYRE.
And if you want to hear more from me, I host my own podcast called Out of Touchstone, where my good friend Chad and I discuss all the films that Disney produced for their Touchstone Pictures label. You can also find me on Twitter at Mike DeKalb.
Thank you, and farewell for the present.